Well, I'm here just to say hello. I'm Sam Less. I'm one of the co-founders of Fin. I'm here with my co-founder, Andrew Cortina, and we're super psyched to have Nan here, who's the VP of Product for Mode. Nan, thanks for joining us today to discuss all this great
happy
stuff.
to be here.
Great. So again, today the topic is, and again, sorry for the confusion in terms of getting set up here. They're talking a little bit about data strategies for optimizing remote CX teams. It's just something, obviously, the three of us have been spending a lot of time thinking about from different angles. And there's a bunch of questions I want to run through to start. We'll spend a bunch of time on questions that we've kind of pre-thought of and kind of some of the things we think are most important. And then obviously we'll open it up to participants for some Q&A at the end. If anyone does have anything super relevant to jump into or has a question about something we're saying, feel free to pop a question into chat or Q&A, and we'll try to hit those as we go. But bigger picture questions we'll do at the end. But yeah, I guess with that, we'll jump right in. And I think the first question that we were discussing a little bit in different forms is kind of some of these questions about the best practices for optimizing remote teams' efficiency and capacity. Efficiency and capacity is a huge topic these days, both because support volumes are way up on a lot of companies, or companies are really, and also they're changing a lot, and teams really care about the efficiency of their workers, especially when they're at home. So guys, I mean, with that kind of in mind, what are some of the things you guys think are most important for optimizing remote team efficiency and capacity?
Yeah, sure. So,
Nan, got anything you want to jump off with?
Yeah. I think so. In terms of support teams, I did a lot of my career at a company called Everlane, where we did a lot of kind of frontline support for for CX teams for people effectively our retail customers, and it was a distributed team, right? Even though we had a central office, it was something that we hired a bunch of people sort of across the country to cover different time zones. And I think that one of the key things is to get at least a step beyond sort of top line, handle time, caseload types of metrics. Those are important KPIs, obviously, because at the end of the day, you're building this machine which is tickets in, tickets out. For us, it was very important to sort of analyze by a lot of different types of slices to not just kind of monitor performance and sort of understand that, but also to sort of set expectations for it. Someone kind of starting the job on day one, we expect, obviously we're not going to expect them to be able to handle the exact caseload that, someone who's kind of been there for a long time. We can kind of see, to try to cohort those things out and try to understand, how things are progressing, right? I think the truth of the matter is a lot of these roles are also kind of high turnover as well. So it's something that you have to really kind of manage and understand that not everyone is the same, right? So having just a single KPI that you're kind of looking at is probably not enough for that. If you want to manage things effectively, right?
Yeah, just to kind of riff on something that Nan said is setting baselines and expectations. So with remote and work from home, it is a quite different environment than the contact center. And so you might have to re-baseline things. And something that we always like to do with anyone that we're working with at Fin is kind of do the typical quintile performance report where we say okay, what is possible? What are the top 20% of people demonstrating is possible? And how do we baseline against that? So one of the sort of first things that I think is important to look at as you transition out of contact center to work from home is, okay, what's the new possible? Is it higher than it was before? Are people more productive when they're working at home? Are they less productive? Is there higher variance in productivity? And then just re-baselining. So it may be in this new world, you have new targets for everyone because it turns out that, being at home is more distracting, and you have multiple family members working from the same home, contending for office space. And that just might bring with it a new set of expectations. So really, you wouldn't want to hold people accountable to sort of the old standards of working within the contact center and rolling it out and doing it based on what their peers are demonstrating is possible is really important.
Yeah, and I'll chime in on this too. I think obviously this is the bread and butter of what Fin does and what we spend our time on. And I think just echoing again, Nan's point, it's look, AHT is kind of a BS concept, right? It's not that it's not worth tracking at the highest level and reporting on a little bit, but it is such a composite of the personal performance and workflows and the type of tickets you're getting volume, all these things munged together, that it's really, really hard to get any signal from, like, for optimizing actively. And so separating out people, process, and tools into separate buckets and separate strategies for how to approach them. And then really understanding what is, into Cortina's point, like not just some external abstract benchmark of AHT or per workflow, but more like literally for your team, what are the 20% best people doing, right? Like, and like, how do you then kind of match to that and see what's possible and how that's changed is like the entire game. And, I do think that it's been an interesting learning where like, this has always been abstractly true, but the switch from home to work from home has just made this so much more urgent for people because a lot of their old assumptions are no longer true, right? Which means that like, you can't just like kind of do the obvious practice you've been doing historically. But yeah. Cool. So I don't know, you guys have anything else you want to contribute on this topic, or should we kind of keep rolling through a few other the things we thought would be interesting to people?
Let's keep it rolling.
All right, let's keep rolling. So I guess the second thing we kind of talked about is like talking a little bit to this question of like, literally how do leaders, if you're leading an operations team, diagnose and then like correct for process inefficiencies? So like obviously process inefficiency is one big contributor, right, to efficiency overall. It's only one of a few, but it is a really important one. And especially now that you can't kind of go look over someone's shoulder or like maybe have intimate familiarity just from osmosis of like what processes are and where inefficiencies are, like what do you do?
Yeah, so I think that there's a few things to consider here, right? Because if maybe you have like good metrics kind of to understand what the baselines are and how folks are doing. But if you want people to improve, you have to have leverage, right? You have to have some kind of wedge into some understanding. But like, hey, where am I going to get return on investment if I'm going to spend some time doing training or process changes or whatnot? So I think being able to kind of like slice your data by a lot of different dimensions, right? The ones that are relevant to your business. At Everlane, like a lot of it is about like, hey, like what kinds of issues are we getting for various different like consumer products that we're selling. At Mode, we're thinking about like, what types of sort of feature surfaces, right? Do people have a lot of trouble with? Like, where are handle times really long because something's really tricky to use or something is like kind of buggy or something like that. And those are the kinds of like kind of first order things about, not only does it tell you something about like your CX like workload and caseload and stuff like that, it tells you something about your product, right? And I think at the end of the day, that's also really important because if we think about as a company, right? If you're an e-commerce company or a SaaS company or whatever, you basically have two main touch points actually three. You have three touch points, right? You have your marketing, you have your product itself, and then you have customer experience, customer service support. And I think a lot of times like people forget that that's like one of the main services that the individual kind of has in terms of the relationship with the organization, right? Like if I'm talking to a particular rep, like to me the company is that rep, right? Like I don't maybe it's Johnny or Christina or whatever the intercom bubble shows me, right? But at the end of the day, like to me that's a representation of the brand and the product itself.
Yeah, something else I've been thinking a bunch about is, like how do you find and make yourself aware of process inefficiencies and like what are your channels for communicating with your people on the ground? And so, in the contact center, there's a sort of like very different set of channels. Like you can go and like hear what people are talking about at the water cooler. You can go and look over somebody's shoulder if you know that they're struggling and just kind of see exactly what they're seeing. One of the things I think that is pretty easy to happen as you shift to remote and lose some of these kind of like more in-person feedback channels is you might start looking just at sort of like quantitative data. And you might just collapse down to like, all we're looking at is handle time, right? Just to take a silly example. And you're going to just lose a lot of like important inputs. And I think that it's really important to try to replace the sort of like more qualitative feedback channels that you would have had when you were in person. So like, if you were doing in-person shadowing or even just like having managers walk the floor, what is the remote replacement of that? How can you like tap somebody on the shoulder or watch with somebody who's struggling or watch with somebody who's really good, which is really important for just trying to understand the root causes of things. Because what is probably going to happen if you're just looking at the numbers is you're saying like, okay, we're accountable for these numbers and each person is like sort of fully responsible for the numbers that they're pushing. but I think Sam mentioned earlier, there's all sorts of inputs to a number an agent is responsible for, right? So like agent average handle time is not only sort of the measure of that particular agent's efficiency, it's also a measure of the tools that they're using, the processes that they're following, their sort of home environment, where they're working, all these other things. And I just think you need to disentangle all the sort of inputs and looking at things in different ways. So like looking at like screen shares and screen recordings of what agents are doing, I think is even more important when you can't just go tap people on the shoulder and observe in person.
Yeah, and I think like just to Cortina's point, like there's like the quantitative approach, right? Where like at Fin, our kind of version of like how we think about process improvement and separating that out from people improvement and tool improvement is one, we kind of only look at like the kind of like the P70, P80 to P20. We kind of lop off the edges, right, of like the absolute best performances and worst performances, because you don't want to like mix in like how the people are doing. You want to understand how like the bulk of the process is going, right, in most of the times. And then you kind of want to first make sure that you're looking across all your processes for the biggest opportunities by saying, well, not only what is inefficient, but what happens a lot and process-wise is inefficient, like which of those sub-processes. And then once you're looking inside that, you can kind of say, okay, these steps are like the key places where like a lot of inefficiency is. So there's a kind of this like, you start with everything, you get rid of like your outlier humans, right, or the people, you focus on the middle, and then within the middle, you focus on like the workflows that are taking a lot of time overall, right? And then you focus and like seem like they have the biggest opportunity for improvement. And then you look for basically the steps that have the most time. So there's a very quantitative like methodology effectively to targeting which workflows you should be examining and what parts of what workflows from a process perspective for improvement. But then to Cortina's point, when you actually go and say, okay, like, what are we going to do here? There's a lot you can tell from the metrics. Like, is there a lot of page switching back and forth here? Is there a lot of typing that seems extraneous given what needs to be done? Like, there are metrics we provide and you can look at, but you can't forget the qualitative thing, which is just saying like, look, just pull up the videos and watch them. Like, not everything has to be pure quantitative data. Like there really is a role for qualitative intervention and feedbacks to know what to optimize. And then you can make an assessment saying, look, the data says this should be easy to optimize, or this is a big process of efficiency. But like when we go and look at it and see where we actually are, like that is that way for a reason. And we can't, that's not an opportunity. So let's look at the next one down, right? In terms of the stack ranking of opportunities around process.
Yeah, I just want to underscore a really important point that Sam made that I think is easy to overlook. When you're live in the contact center, I think a lot of this, the qualitative review can happen in a way it's just random sampling. And one of the things that you can capitalize on with the shift to remote is, being very quantitative about what gets a qualitative review, right? So like looking at a workflow with a particularly high variance, or looking at, a certain quintile of agent performers and spending your qualitative review time on those things. If you're sort of like quantitative about what gets qualitative review, you can be way, way more efficient with all your QA processes and make sure your QA team is looking at the highest leverage opportunities and reviewing those. And I think, just taking this shift to remote work, great opportunity to do that, because we see a lot of companies where they're still doing some sort of like random QA, which is just not the best way to prioritize that sort of team's time.
Before we move on, I'm actually quite curious. Nan, have you, in your experiences to date and what you've seen, have you ever followed like a defined methodology around this type of stuff, or have you done it a lot of different ways?
Yeah, so I think the way that look, all of your processes are kind of like shaped by the tools that are available to you, right? And whatever resolution you happen to have in your data. And I think what I sort of appreciate about Fin's product is that it gives you sort of resolution that kind of changes your fundamental assumptions about like what you can actually understand, right, at scale. So you can kind of think of that process going both ways, right? Like the first one is like, hey, like Cortina just said, right, which is like I can focus my qualitative efforts on some like areas that I kind of see at scale, right, and try to sort of diagnose the root cause of those things and figure that out. But you can also go the other way around, which is if I have a few folks who are sort of outliers of performance, either good or bad, and I can kind of see certain areas where they're very efficient or where they're very problematic, then I can also see like, okay, well, what's the blast radius of that that particular step, right? Is there an opportunity for efficiency everywhere, right? Because like, they're doing much better than the average, or is there an opportunity, or is there, some kind of problem with the process where everyone's having trouble with the same thing, right? Like you can sort of ask that follow-up question in an intelligent way. So I think that's kind of, those are the two, if you want to talk about a framework, those are the two sort of approaches that I take.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, again, like it's definitely, there's no question that, I mean, even the broad scope of society, it's like what you measure informs, your knowledge, and informs like what you can do, right? And like the resolution of measurement is pretty fundamental. We certainly believe that. Cool. So just keep rolling, I guess, is like, one thing I've been really interested recently in, because it's, I wouldn't say it's new, but it's newly important, is like understanding the actual technical performance, right, of your tools, not just in terms of like your web tools, but like literally like you have a bunch of people at home with Chromebooks or something new they hadn't had before, connecting over all sorts of different ISPs and connection settings. And like it really impacts work, right? Like if you're on a fast computer with a good connection, people just do way better work than if they're not. And so, again, like this is a little bit self-serving because obviously our tools do a really good job of this, I would argue. But like I am curious, and I'll start with you, Nan, and then kind of I'm happy to talk about what we do, is like, what have you seen companies doing to like understand like the network performance, right, that their actual agents are getting, especially now they're stuck work from home with their machines doing work?
Yeah, so I can sort of speak to sort of what I've seen on the ground, right? And in terms of like what's widespread, the tools aren't super great, right? Most of it involves asking your team, hey, why don't you go to fast.com and see what your up down is, and then if it's below a certain threshold, maybe we'll FedEx you like a wireless hotspot or something like that, see if it makes a difference, right? It's like it's usually that level of fidelity. And the sample rate's not exactly huge, right? Like I don't know, maybe your network was having a great day or a bad day at that moment, and that's sort of the reading that you got. So I think in those kinds of like very distributed IT questions, the general practices are still pretty primitive there.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we actually, this is, I would argue, hopefully the most self-serving part of this conversation, is we're trying to talk to a broader theme, but like, this has kind of like been really interesting for us because we had a bunch of customers of ours start asking us, being like, hey, can you like help with this problem? And the answer is we hadn't done it before, but like, obviously, of course we can, right? Like, because we have the page load speed of every single page load that people are doing, right? From when it's requested to when it starts loading to when it finishes loads. Plus, we have kind of constant video upload, right? Plus, we know things like how many windows are open at a given time, what actual memory and and like CPU people are running, et cetera. We have like incredibly high resolution on exact network performance, up, down, and like literally the local performance that every single agent is getting all the time. And this has turned out to be really valuable because like most companies have a bunch of SLAs with both ISPs as well as potentially subcontractors, right? About what the people at home should be getting, right? And it really matters not like what some headline stat is, to your point, Nan, about your network having a good day or bad day, what like the performance people are actually getting on their machines, and then which interventions you're going to pull. Like, and so for us, like being able to say like, okay, literally at the machine level, like this is what's happening. This person's machine is like loading things really well. This person's waiting 5 seconds for every page to load, right? It's because they have 1,000 browser windows open, or their machine is underpowered, or their network connection is bad. And here's the exact performance, has been like a really powerful tool for like, in some ways, debugging like a whole new type of, tool issues that people didn't used to think about, because you're kind of in a network, you're in a service center, there is some local IT guy who's kind of managing this stuff and it's all reasonable. It becomes like a really high importance issue. So I don't know. That's the self-serving part. If you want this stuff real time and continuously, we can give it to you. I don't know, Cortina, anything to chime in on that, or like, did I just basically talk the book?
That's more your wheelhouse.
I love this stuff. It makes me really happy. It's just so practical and so easily, immediately actionable. Another thing we've had coming up a bunch, and again, I think we'll do the normal thing where I'd love to hear what you're thinking, and we can talk a little bit about some other options, is like remote security and fraud. Sure. It's actually a relatively similar set of problems in signature, I would argue, to this bandwidth thing, because it's a thing that like people have physical security practices, lock your phone away, et cetera, when you're local. You just can't do it at home. So like, what's happening in terms of like how people are doing like security and fraud detection now that people are kind of more remote?
Yeah. So I think I'll approach that from, a few different angles, right? There's a sort of physical security, thing, fleet management, like those types of questions. And, it gets a little bit tricky depending on what what the shape of your business is, right? A lot of times these tools are pretty invasive, honestly, right? And and whether or not it's like a company machine and those kinds of questions like that's all, and whatever are they W-2 or are they contract worker, and like all those kinds of questions come into play. So I found that to be, like something that we've had to sort of talk to a lot of IT folks about and sort of get a handle on. I'd love to know what y'all's take on that is. And then there's the sort of more sort of like human-based kind of security and fraud and those kinds of things. You could imagine if you're working in an e-commerce space, like a lot of the support agents have a lot of powers, right, to do stuff that involves real money, real transactions. And so those kinds of things, we definitely put in, like when I was at Everline, we put in specific metrics in place to at least kind of control for those things, right? Like how much, how much sort of like consumer credit is associated with each individual like agent, or at what rate are they handing this out. There's a minimum there too. It's like we want them to be using some of these resources to sort of help customers out and like solve their problems and make them happy and things like that too. So there was like a band that we were looking at, and if anyone went out of band by any significant margin, it would kind of raise a flag and we kind of look. That said, like part of that was because that was basically the resolution that we could get at, right? Like there's the data that we have is the data we have, and we try to do the best we can. So what I'm interested in hearing from you guys, honestly, is like what are things that that are more sort of behavioral, that are like more maybe granular, right? Then here's how much credit you handed out, or here's how many discounts you gave. That I'd love to hear about.
Yeah, I can chime in. Having been spending a bunch of time on SOC 2 compliance myself recently, a lot of this stuff is top of mind. I mean, the first thing I'll say is that, again, there's a bunch of assumptions baked into a lot of security and compliance policies around a contact center and things happening from the network there, things happening on devices that never leave that facility. And so like the first kind of like easy pass stuff that I think people had to do was like beef up their kind of like VPN to let people remote access, just even like testing that stuff to make sure that people knew how to do it, was something that we saw a lot of people having issues with. And then just making sure you have like the basics, like, disk encryption on all the remote devices, strong password enforcement, all that stuff is kind of like the baseline. In terms of the more interesting stuff, I think that we've started thinking about, particularly with our data set, is if you think about like consumer fraud, right? It's like a large population of people. There's like a small percentage of bad actors, and like we want to kind of like mitigate the overall risk in that population and just look for anomalies. And so, coming from Venmo, where we had to do a lot of like consumer fraud prevention, we would look for things like, lots of activity from a particular IP address or account signups from the same IP address, things like that. And the interesting thing is to start thinking about this new agent behavioral data set in the same way, because I think a lot of people, weren't thinking about this in the contact center. One, because maybe there were other ways to mitigate risk, but then also because kind of like data sets like the ones that we collect didn't exist, frankly. So a few things that we've started looking at are just like sort of like outliers in terms of like time spent on certain tools. Like it's quite easy to write reports of like, okay, there's a certain page, has like sensitive information, right? Like the like customer billing information, right? Like, are there any outliers in terms of agents spending more time on that, or outliers in terms of like navigation from there to some other page that's like kind of not the expected tool, right? Like if you always expect somebody to go from like Salesforce CRM to the customer billing page back to Salesforce, and you see like some people going from like Salesforce CRM to customer billing page to like Google Docs, maybe something needs to be looked at there, right? So being able to like kind of like identify the sort of like key most sensitive resources and then start setting up like heuristics and patterns to detect anomalies in behavior that you might want to like investigate, is something that we've started thinking about. And then the other big one is just like, what are the sort of like, we don't track every single keystroke that happens, But we do track certain patterns, like, okay, well, like what pages are people doing a keyboard copy command on, and then what pages are they doing a paste command on, and is that what you would expect to see? And you kind of would expect it to be like you're copying from like an internal knowledge base and then pasting it into like a chat to a customer or something. That's another one where you can imagine it being pretty useful to be looking at that data when you're thinking about like fraud prevention. And something that Nan mentioned, this one, like I think is worth talking explicitly about a little bit more, is just there is this tension between all the kind of security measures that you're going to have in place and then the privacy of the people doing the work on your team. And there's always a trade-off between security and privacy. One of the things that we've found, useful to have people remind their teams of is like, nobody has time to go watch 8 hours a day of your video, and like just watch that and like watch every single thing you're doing. And certainly nobody has time to, have 8 hours of video per day reviewed for every person on their team. It's just not going to happen. Right. So it's not about like watching every second of somebody's video or like, dinging them for taking a 30-second break after they finish a case. And I think there's like all these sort of like worries you have as an agent on the ground about, what does constant screen capture entail? And so I think just setting up the right expectations around this stuff and saying like, okay, like here's how we're going to use this data. Here are like you're not going to get penalized for such and such. It's really only to find these sort of like outlier behaviors and protect everyone's every customer's data is the sort of goal of this stuff. And I think kind of setting up the explicit expectations around how stuff will be used is really the most critical way to manage that trade-off between security and privacy.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in on this. I mean, there's a lot, obviously, to unpack there, but I'd say, well, two other thoughts. One is I think our number one rule, which is different from a lot of other organizations, is transparency about what's being saved and what isn't, right? There's no surreptitiousness in it. I actually think there are services out there, you probably know of, that are like much more covert in terms of like what they're logging and how, and like it creates a lot of mistrust, right? And like in organizations, I think we have a bunch of hooks built in where it's like very clear to everyone what's happening. And then because there's that transparency and openness in terms of like, the kind of culture you try to create around this type of stuff, you actually can allow more freedom, right? The idea is like when you don't have that, when you don't have observability, companies get stuck in this game of like, for fraud reasons, of locking everything down. They're like, we have to lock everything down because we don't know what's going on. And so we have to like proactively set rules to prevent fraud or whatever. The more you be like, look, your job is to do great work. Like, don't commit fraud. By the way, we have instrumentation and everything. So if you commit fraud, we'll know, right? Like, I actually think that creates a much healthier culture in a lot of ways and like allows a lot more freedom than the alternative.
Yeah, I kind of want to. I really like your point about just like, a lot of times folks try to solve these problems using like procedurally, right? Hey, there are very strict rules that you must follow and blanket, and you can't make any exceptions, even if it makes a lot of sense to do a particular thing. And what we found is like certainly like at Mode we have a lot of customers' data flows and stuff like that we handle. It's very sensitive stuff, right? And we have access controls and audit trails and all that kind of stuff for all of our internal tools because that's something that we really spend a lot of effort building out. And I think the difficulty with a lot of organizations is that if they don't have the resources to invest in those kinds of things, what they end up doing is like creating a lot of draconian type of measures because they don't have the visibility. And I think that's sort of like one of the core trade-offs in there, right? Which is like, are you going to let people kind of perform at their capacity and help people out and give them a lot of freedom to do that, but you also have to kind of cover the downside. And I think like that causes is like these really sort of kind of unfriendly conservative postures in a lot of organizations because they just don't have the resolution to have any kind of trail.
There's this like deep, it's kind of like counterintuitive that like measurement creates freedom. Right? Whereas like this thing I've kind of learned in my career more broadly is like, I think when you're young, you start out and you're like, what I'm doing is unmeasurable. It's so cool and good. And like, don't like saddle me with measurement. And then you get a little bit more perspective. And you're like, oh, the more things are measured and we're all on the same page, the more like there actually is freedom to operate, right? Because you can all of a sudden like people can just make good decisions and like it's clear what's happening and not. And like, when bad things are happening, and when good things are happening, right? So I think it's a pretty healthy dynamic. Cool. So I guess we'll do one more of these kind of high level questions, and then I think I see at least one question I want to answer from Peter about human motivation and motivating teams, and I'm sure if other people have questions, they should chime in with them. Which is a little bit about like how can leaders manage like performance outliers and drive consistency of work is kind of like the biggest one. And maybe now you can start again per our pattern here a little bit talking about like kind of some of the coaching from Everlane and your experience there.
Yeah. So I think I'll talk a little bit Everlane and also Mode. They're two very different, types of, kind of support behaviors, right? With Everlane, it's something like most people have bought something online before. They've gone through the support cycle. They know in their heads, like, hey, here's a great example of when someone handled it really well. And here was a terrible customer service situation that I was in at one point, right? So what we asked folks to do was like think of the great ones, right? And like what did those people do in those really great experiences that that made you have those good memories of it? Okay, baseline before you do any kind of training, just your benchmark should be replicate that, right? Just make decisions that are consistent with that particular experience that you had that you remember being great, right? And that's going to get you 80% of the way there, right? All the sort of individual practices and trainings that we're going to have, those are the things on top of it that like kind of shape, this particular role you have. But like start from like that sort of like human empathy kind of perspective, and then we'll teach all the tools and those kinds of things, right? And then for folks kind of early on in their process, it's like, look, we want the best way to do this stuff is also by learning. So we're going to teach you the basic tools, the basic moves that you have. And you might run into these kinds of situations. And if you do, you should escalate to a manager and we'll do the training just in time, right? We'll do that training just in time so that you can have a real case in front of you. We don't have to make this like kind of artificial case study or whatever it is, so that when you run into this, sort of how this feels in real life, what the sort of emotional feeling looks like when a customer's complaining about stuff and they're writing the huge long emails and whatever it happens to be. So that was something that was like a core part of the focus. That like training is going to be gradual. There's going to be a ramp up time, but the core thing to do is think about the good experiences you had and then go from there. At Mode, it's a little bit different, right? Because like the product is very technical, right? It's like people who are using it are analysts who are like really data driven and they're pretty sophisticated, right? So like you might not go into it knowing all of the tool surface, and that's okay, right? There's a pretty extensive training program that's set up and with like kind of common questions that people ask and definitions and basic glossaries and things like that. And then a lot of times you're going to have to escalate this into product management or engineering and do that kind of level 2 thing and have a conversation with them. That's an expectation that we set up front as well. But like there is quite a lot more sort of active training. I think in both those situations, there is like a just-in-time component, right? Like either if you're escalating in engineering for the sort of B2B SaaS kind of situation, or if you're running into a case and you have to like talk to a more senior kind of manager on the CX team and kind of talk about it. And like those are the moments where like what we're relying on is individual agents like taking the initiative to escalate it, right? As opposed to try to muddle through or ignoring that issue or whatever it happens to be. And what I sort of, when I was at Everlane, what I really wished for was like, hey, are there certain kind of signals I could have, right, to like know that like this person is like hitting this kind of tricky situation, so that I can maybe even proactively either monitor it or even go kind of intervene and kind of like say, hey, I noticed that you're in this kind of tricky situation. Let's talk about it a little bit.
Fair enough. Cortina, any comments you want to make on this one?
I mean. Well, my doorbell's ringing, so there you go. I'll be right back.
I'll go. That's hilarious. Welcome to work from home, everyone. This would totally screw his handle time on this event. I'm kidding. Although not, I guess. Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that I think the just-in-time idea is like absolutely right, and we certainly believe in, and like you do need different tools for that, right? To be able to do just-in-time remote. It can't just be like Slack and raise your hand, right? Like it doesn't work anymore. And so like I think having that in the replay and things like that is pretty important. Yeah, I think the other thing is just like honestly, like once you have clear data, right? I think just having honest conversations is just so much easier, right? About outlier performance. And like I think that's the problem without data is you get into a lot of debates with people, I think, about outlier performance. Like, this both on the positive and negative, like both it's like this cultural thing where people will be like, well, these, I'm struggling, but these people are like cheating or something like that. Like there's like kind of all these like weird dynamics that come up. Like these people are cheating by only picking up the easy tasks, or, there's a lot of kind of, and I'm just a big believer that like the more you can have complete transparency on this type of stuff, the better cultures you create. That's like a big part of how you manage outliers. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard question in the end of the day. It really is just about like creating a culture, which I want to talk about in a second because people keep asking culture questions in our chat. Creating a culture of openness and collaboration and transparency, knowing that not everyone's going to know everything, having the right support structures in mind and in place to kind of do the just-in-time training and kind of going from there. Like I don't think there's any magic to this, right? Good people want to do good work, right? And you just kind of have to empower them with the right coaching and the right time, and dumping a bunch of information on them and being like, you're on your own, like it's your job on that, is like just not a productive thing to do. Even though it's like hard and tempting, when it comes down to kind of remote and like all the crazy things that are going on. So I'm now looking at a bunch of our Q&A questions, and like I think the number one thing that's come up from a bunch of people, Peter's asking about it in terms of adjusting for motivation, team cohesion, things like that. Michael's asking about this culture question and how do you manage a virtual culture, all these types of things. So I'm kind of curious, like I have some things I want to say on this, but you guys have anything you want to chime in on, like what it means to have a work from home culture and how to make a good one?
I mean, one thing that that I think often about is the sort of like positive feedback loops and like giving positive feedback to like the people on the ground. A lot of times the numbers that get measured are things like error rate or handle time, and it can just get to be like, it can feel like all you're doing is trying to like manage mistakes and just be like overly negative focused. And then I think a lot of times when you do see like some of the positive reinforcement stuff that happens, it does tend to be in person. So I think it's pretty important to think about like what are the replacements for that, and like how do you celebrate the people who are doing awesome work. One of my favorite examples of this was like a team that we were managing. We had this concept of all-stars, and there were like sort of like different, a couple different things on the agent scorecard. Any given like week or two, we would have like a review of the all-stars, or actually we would have a review of the stars in any given category. So who are like the top 10 people or whatever, or who hit the sort of like best in class performance benchmark for a particular metric that week. And then the all-stars were people that did that across every dimension, which can be pretty tricky to do because, say you have a quality metric and an efficiency metric, those are often trading against each other. So if you're hitting both of those as best in class, it means you're doing really exceptional work and kind of like managing that trade-off really well. And so thinking about just stuff like, if you were doing like a daily stand-up and like giving people props through that, how are you going to be doing that and like celebrating the people who are doing the best work in this remote environment, and giving people that sort of like positive encouragement, I think is something that is really worth investing a lot in, and may not have been the first thing that people thought about how to transition to remote when they were just scrambling to get their feet underneath them.
Yeah. Now, do you have any personal experiences you want to share about creating positive cultures that might apply to remote?
Yeah, so I think one of the and again, it's a lot of times like when people talk about like, hey, specifically applying the remote, like I think about like any organization that's like large enough is effectively remote in a lot of ways. So like, one specific thing. What's up?
A good point.
One specific thing that I really remember is, I think we tried to do very, very early on at Everlane was that like, we were just starting to build a brand, right? And like people that had not had that many kind of distinct experiences, so every sort of interaction like really counted. And when we saw like we would kind of go through Zendesk at the time, right? And then kind of like see like what's been going on, what are people complaining about. And if we saw something get handled really well, like we would really like take a moment to highlight it, right? And say like, hey, here's a transcript of like this back and forth with the customer. Like, look, this is great, right? This is exactly what we want, right? Like this is it's a great interaction. Use the right language, you ask the right questions, all this kind of stuff. And and I think that in kind of formats where everything's written down, like it's possible to do that. It takes a little bit of effort, but even just like a couple examples, like kind of consistently kind of put out there, not only make the people who did the thing like feel good, like that's an important thing to reward good behavior, and good performance, right? But also kind of like sets the example about like, hey, here's what it looks like to everybody else, right? And sort of like form that culture about a lot of times people are kind of it's weird. They're almost like they feel like they need permission to like go one step beyond like the baseline, right? In terms of handling, it's like, look, you have permission, right? Because we're highlighting this thing, and this is the sort of model that you ought to think about following.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like, we absolutely agree with this. And I think this is like, it's so easy to fall in the pattern of just being obsessed with like places where there's like an efficiency problem or whatever. And like, look, if you have a culture, and there's, especially at home, where like the days all blend together, that's been the joke, right? And you're just sitting, literally your entire workday is sitting there, and you're doing requests, and you're trying to help customers. And the only time you're going to hear from a manager or like, be highlighted in a group is like when you're doing badly. That's going to create a negative culture. The second you kind of create a culture where it's like, oh, like I'm every single opportunity, every single thing that comes up, like I am on a team. Like we are trying to do amazing work for these people, support this brand, be the voice of the brand. And like, I know every time I'm in there, like it's an opportunity to do something awesome, get highlighted, be shown to my other team members as like having done awesome work. We used to like replay the video, you know what I mean? Like you have a meeting, you're like, here's not only the all-stars and calling out people, but like sick interactions. Here's exactly what happened. Like clap, props. Like it really, it just changes the tone so dramatically. And so I think like honestly, like bringing more energy to that and like really doing that even more when teams are more disconnected is important, because you're not gonna get like the casual like I'm sitting next to someone high five, right? Like great job. Like there isn't that like inherited culture. So you have to kind of create more framework around it. Is my sense.
Yeah, I think the one thing I'll just add to that, right, is that in remote, the biggest difference about remote settings is that you don't get all those kind of like defaults and implicit, here's the right thing to do. So you end up with this big vacuum. And unless you're like filling the vacuum with something that you're like, hey, like this is what we should be, right? Then the only signal people are going to get are like negative signal. Yeah. And they're trying to manage by exception. It's not like, it's not a fun time for anybody, and it's not going to be something, it's not going to be efficient, right? Like the best way to do it is to say like, here's what we should do, and have that dominate over everything else, as opposed to we're only going to tell you when things go wrong. So like be on your tippy toes.
Totally. So let's answer a few more if you guys have a few more minutes to discuss. We got people with calendar invites for a few more minutes. There's this question that comes up a lot, which is like, okay, so when you get more strategic and scientific about managing operations teams and investing in it versus kind of just doing and hitting a ticket volume, how do you avoid like the big brother conversation? Or what do you say when someone's like, this is really invasive and like you're measuring everything and this is bad, right? From that perspective. I'm happy to answer this. Why don't I? Oh, Cortina.
Well, I kind of hit on this a little bit when we were talking about this sort of like security and privacy trade-off, where, nobody has time to watch 8 hours a day of video and like watch every single thing that you're doing. So like, yeah, well, in theory, this is possible. I mean, one, it's just not practical. And two, I'm like, as a manager, I'm telling you, like, this is not how we're going to use this data. And just being really transparent about the fact that, one, yeah, the big brother thing is possible, but the goal is not to like see every time you go and like look at a news article when you're on break, or like watch stuff that would be an invasion of your privacy. The goal is really to just collect more data that's going to make the entire team better. And I think the cool thing about this is the point that Nan made earlier, which is in a lot of ways that this does give people more freedom and flexibility, because you can trade out rules and restrictions and just use like auditing of anomalies to replace all the rules and restrictions. So in a lot of ways, people are going to get more freedom because more stuff is being measured, and you can just sort of catch stuff after the fact. I mean, this is actually a funny analogy, but we were just talking to somebody on the call yesterday about the sort of way the government does with like taxes. Like they're going to trust you to do it right, and then they'll audit you if they see something that falls outside of the band of normal activity. It's just way more efficient to do things like that. And so that's the other sort of like way you can pitch it to people, is like, this is a more efficient way to do stuff than have everybody like follow a bunch of like stupid rules that are really only there. The rules are there to like block the bad people from doing the wrong thing, but most people are good, right? And so like having too many rules is like not the right investment of effort if we can use the data to accomplish the same sort of risk mitigation.
Yeah, the other thing I'll try to add to that, right, is that like, especially when you're thinking about remote settings, one of the biggest struggles that a lot of people have is visibility, right? They don't have FaceTime with their manager. They're not like in the office with their team. And I think what this gives us opportunity to do, right, is like give visibility for people who are like, hey, I'm doing the right thing, I'm doing really well, right? I'm doing stuff, I'm being creative, like whatever it happens to be that you think you need visibility into in order to advance your career or to get recognition, get a raise, like whatever it happens to be. And I think that like if there's a piece of it where it's not just framing, right? It's not just like lip service. It's like an actual ability for us to sort of like see like we talked about outliers. We talked about both positive and negative outliers, right? Like those positive outliers probably have more visibility, right, and have like better opportunities in this situation than they otherwise would have.
Yeah, I'd add two things to that. One, in terms of the positive negatives, is like rarely, I mean, it does happen, but like mostly what you find is that humans or people who are working on a team that are working hard, there's certain things they're good at and there's certain things they need help on, right? They're like an outlier in certain categories, but need help on others. And like without good resolution of data, you just become so black and white. You're like, you're good, you're bad. Like, I don't have more to say. I don't have more to coach. I don't have more interactions. But like with data, right, and with the bigger picture, you can have that more nuanced conversation, help them where they're struggling, and actually have a very positive interaction with there. But I mean, I think at a high level, like the reality is like data is power. Like, insight is power, and you can use it for good or bad. There's a really nice function, I think, from the Big Brother conversation, which is really simple, which is, look, you could theoretically use a bunch of this data to micromanage people, and you'll lose all your people, right? And when you lose all your people, it turns out that like training and hiring is by far the most expensive thing. So it's a very, very bad idea, right? Like from an overall organizational efficiency. And in that way, management and like teams are actually highly aligned, right? Like what you want to do is like use data in a productive, healthy way, like to get people the right answer and like be transparent and upfront about it. And we've seen really good responses to this. I mean, I think it's a thing that you always have to think about, and like you should think about how you're going to explain what you are and aren't doing and set your own guidelines as a different org. But like fundamentally, it's like I think teams understand this. Is my sense. All right, so maybe we'll do one more question since I think they've come up, and then we'll kind of thank everyone and can continue this conversation offline or in other contexts, which is. I'm actually kind of curious, are there any like aha moments people have had, right? We're like looking at data that, again, like we can talk about it from a film perspective or non from your perspective, things you come in, like, what are some of like the like, oh my God, that's super cool moments that we've kind of experienced that like are kind of answer changing? Anyone want to offer any?
I mean, I can sort of remember one specific sort of moment once we started having like reasonable tagging inside of our admin interface inside of Everlane. Like we realized that there were like very specific return issues that just took forever, right? There were like extreme outliers to handle those issues, and we actually fed that back into the product, and we built better tooling for folks. And it wasn't just like, oh, we could handle better ticket volume at that point, but like it was a total pain in the butt, right, for anybody having to deal with these issues. And occasionally people will like kind of complain about, but no one wants to complain, right? So like getting that signal, it took timing data, right, to sort of understand like how much time were people, like sitting in particular tools or dealing with certain types of cases that managed to get us that insight and then make everyone's lives better, honestly.
Yeah. I'll mention, like, I think it really is, to your point, it's like there's a bunch of like really obvious things sometimes once you have the data, right? So I'll give you an example. Like we came up recently, we were working with some teams on where like, it turns out that like one of their service centers, the internet connection was just terrible, right? And like, we literally diagnosed this. They didn't know. We then rewatched videos and showed them what was happening. And like, it was taking 20 seconds to load a page. And like, your team is going to have bad metrics when that's the case, right? Like there's just no way around that, right? And it's like a quick fix, really easy fix and great answer, right? Great impact in terms of efficiency. Outliers is a great one to call out. I mean, it's been staggering, I think, across many teams. When you start looking per case at like the top 5% of cases and what percentage of time that's taking, universally, it's like 25 to 35% of all operations team going into like 5% of tickets. Right. And so like when you say like, oh my God, the scope isn't like, I need to figure out all these tickets. It's like literally I can get, a 20%, overall performance improvement just by focusing on these tickets. Like, it's unbelievable, like the payoff from that. And it really can just be a quick process change or retraining on something specific that you didn't even know was there. I think there's been some really exciting ones and really, really easy, relative to, I think sometimes operational leaders come into these things like, my solution is going to be automation on everything. And like, I'm not anti-automation. Like, there's a lot you can do with automation, but there usually is like really obvious low-hanging fruit from simple analysis.
Yeah, the one I'll add on top of that is just the sort of like being able to layer in all of the sort of like resource and tools timeline on top of the case data. It's just like X-ray for X-ray view for your typical CRM data, because just looking at like the a case and saying like, okay, an agent spent 25 minutes on this case. I have the transcript, but that does not tell me how the agent was spending their time. Or I have the call log and I can listen to that, but the agent may put somebody on hold for 10 minutes and go do a bunch of work. And so debugging that, it's pretty inefficient to do it, if not impossible, with just the transcript and call log. Once you have the video and can replay it, and then once you can also kind of like segment out different cases by the time required of agents in certain internal tools, you can really uncover a lot of issues that maybe looked like agent performance issues or training issues and are actually tools problems. And so just mashing up those data sets of like, where are actually agents spending time when they're working on particular case types is really powerful. And it can often expose things that are problems with something that is the responsibility of another team that's not even the operations team, which the operations team is currently being held accountable for. So having that data, and this is another one too, that where the sort of like measurement is aligned with the agents on the ground. Of like, agents are being held accountable today for things like handle time, when there are things that are totally outside of their control that contribute to that. Being able to shed light on those things, like the network speed or like the tool load time, or broken tools that kind of like crash and lose work without auto saving it. These are all really easy things to diagnose once you have a lot more data.
Yeah. Cool. Well, look, I think at that we're at time. Nan, thank you for joining. Rayling, who's on the line, thank you for organizing everything. Cortina, thanks as always. This is a good conversation. If anyone wants to follow up with us, or has more they want to talk about, or talk about our tools, or experiences that we can be helpful broadly in this kind of wild time and what happens in the future, founders at FinXPC is a great way to reach out to us, or certainly hit us up at Fin or whatever else. But thank you again for everyone for taking the time today. Hopefully you enjoyed it and learned something. Yeah. And we're always here.
And we'll be sending out a recap of the talk and a video as well. So thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.